He fought for his country, but when he came home, his own town refused to serve him a meal. In a town where the war had ended, but hatred hadn't, a black veteran named Elijah Brooks learned that peace was still a privilege he couldn't afford. The sun rose over Waverly, Georgia, casting a soft glow on the peeling white paint of old houses and the sagging porches, where people still clung to habits older than change itself. Elijah stepped off the Greyhound bus that morning with nothing but a duffel bag and a folded uniform pressed like a memory he could never forget. The bus hissed and drove away, leaving him standing at the edge of a place that looked the same, but somehow felt colder. The air carried the faint scent of wet clay and pine sap, the same smell he remembered from childhood, yet it stung differently now. Main Street stretched ahead, quiet and watchful, with its row of stores and their faded shop local signs. Behind every window pane, eyes seemed to follow him. Some recognized him, others pretended not to. He walked past the barber shop where he'd once waited for his father on Saturdays, the hardware store where he'd bought his first fishing rod, and the diner where the Welcome Home Soldiers banner fluttered proudly. But his name was missing from the handwritten list taped to the glass. He noticed it, paused for half a heartbeat, and kept walking. For Elijah, war had been simpler. In uniform, he had belonged to something bigger than himself. On foreign soil, no one cared about the color of his skin when bullets filled the air. But back in Waverly, his medals meant little. The church bells tolled that Sunday morning as he passed the chapel, and though a few nodded in forced politeness, most turned away. The whispers trailed behind him like smoke, quiet, cutting, familiar. "That's him," someone muttered. "The one who went off and came back. Different." Different was always a safer word than unwanted. He rented a small cabin at the edge of town, where the fields opened into a patch of pine woods. The roof sagged and the porch creaked under his boots, but it offered something the town couldn't: silence. Elijah set his duffel down and stood for a moment, breathing in the solitude. In that space between loneliness and peace, he found a strange comfort. Nights were the hardest. The sound of crickets and far-off trains reminded him of base nights in Afghanistan, the endless watch under desert stars. Sometimes he woke before dawn, his chest tight, the echo of explosions replaced by the whisper of wind against the window pane. The sheriff passed by his property more than once in those first few weeks, pretending to check for storm damage. Everyone knew it was something else. In a town like Waverly, a black man living alone in the woods wasn't trusted. The war had ended for everyone except him. Elisha spent his days repairing the old fence that lined his property, mending what time and neglect had broken. The repetition steadied him. When the hammer met the nail, he felt control again. Each strike pushed away a fragment of the noise in his mind, the shouts, the cries, the memories of soldiers who never made it home. One gray afternoon, while walking back from the diner with a sack of canned goods, he heard it, a faint whimper coming from the alley behind the building. The sound was small, desperate, almost swallowed by the hum of rain. Elijah hesitated. The last thing he needed was another reminder of something fragile. But the sound came again, trembling and thin, and he followed it. Behind the diner, amid piles of wet cardboard and rusting trash cans, he found a stray puppy, half-starved, trembling, its fur matted with mud, the creature's ribs pressed against its skin, and its tail tucked tightly under its belly. Its eyes, wide and uncertain, met his for a single heartbeat before looking away. Elijah crouched slowly, careful not to frighten it. His hands were scarred, calloused from years of holding weapons and tools, but now they hovered in the air, unsure of how to offer comfort. He spoke softly, though the rain nearly drowned out his voice. The dog didn't move. The cold drops fell harder, and he noticed the creature's shivers worsening. He sighed, lowering his hand a little closer. In the stillness of that alley, something shifted. Maybe it was pity, or maybe it was recognition. Two souls worn down by a world that had turned cruel too easily. The puppy sniffed his fingers, hesitated, and finally leaned forward, pressing its head against his palm. Elijah felt an unexpected sting in his chest. The same hands that had once carried rifles now cradled something fragile, something alive. The contrast startled him. He took off his jacket and wrapped the puppy gently, shielding it from the rain. Its small heartbeat fluttered against his arm as he stood, feeling the weight of something new, responsibility, perhaps even purpose. As he walked back toward his cabin, the rain softened into mist. The few townsfolk still out that evening watched him from their porches, muttering quietly as he passed. Some saw a man rescuing an animal. Others saw something they didn't understand and didn't want to. He didn't look their way. The dog stirred slightly, then went still, trusting him in a way people hadn't in years. When Elijah reached the cabin, he placed the puppy near the fire and began warming it with a towel. The tiny creature whimpered once, then fell asleep, exhaustion overtaking fear. Elijah sat beside it, staring into the flames. The room smelled of wet wood and smoke. For the first time in a long while, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt alive. Outside, Waverly's night stretched on. The same old town, breathing the same old hate, unchanged and unbothered. But inside that cabin, something small had begun to heal. A man scarred by war and a dog broken by neglect shared a fragile peace neither had known before. Elijah didn't yet understand why he'd stopped to help, or why it mattered, but somewhere deep down, he sensed that this simple act, born from instinct and mercy, was more than chance. He didn't know that in saving the animal, he had already begun to change the town that had never forgiven him. He didn't know that one day, the world would remember both their names. He bent down to check on the puppy, its breathing soft and steady. Outside, the wind picked up again, whispering through the pine trees like a warning. Elijah glanced toward the darkness beyond his window. Somewhere out there, something was shifting, quietly, unseen, unstoppable. He bent down to help the animal, unaware that this simple act of mercy would one day rewrite the soul of the entire town. Sometimes, the broken recognize each other before anyone else does. That truth followed Elijah Brooks home the day he carried the trembling puppy into his cabin, the rain still clinging to its fur, and the cold still trapped in its bones. For years, Elijah had walked through life armored, his grief buried under discipline and quiet routines. But the small creature seemed to look straight through him. As soon as he set the puppy near the fading warmth of the fireplace, it tried to stand and follow him, its legs wobbling like it had forgotten how to trust the ground. Elijah watched it for a moment, recognizing that stubbornness, that refusal to be left behind. He moved through the room, wringing out his jacket, laying out a bowl of water and a torn piece of bread, and still the puppy kept its gaze locked on him, as if waiting for orders. That loyalty, so immediate and undeserved, reached a place in him that war had not managed to numb. He decided the animal needed a name, something simple and right. All that day and into the evening, the puppy trailed him from room to room, padding softly across the wooden floorboards, curling beside his boots when he sat, lifting its head whenever he shifted. It moved like a second silhouette, a quiet echo of every step. Shadow, he thought. The dog was a shadow, not of the house but of him, a living shape that refused to let him stay alone. He began calling him Shadow in his mind before the name ever left his lips. Days in Waverly were slow, and loneliness liked to stretch itself across the hours. But with Shadow there, the silence became less like an accusation and more like a resting place. Elijah cleaned the dog's small wounds with careful hands, dabbing away dried mud and old scratches, the kind a stray collects while trying to survive between garbage bins and back alleys. Shadow winced, but never pulled away. Elijah shared bits of meat from his dinner, laid out blankets near the hearth, and opened the cabin door each morning for long walks through the back roads where no one bothered them. The town watched, though, always watching. People in Waverly had sharp memories and sharper tongues. They saw the veteran, with the stray, and twisted it into something to talk about over coffee and pie. Some said he had lost his mind overseas. Some said he trusted animals more than people. The cruelest ones hinted that a man living alone in the woods with a dog was proof that war had damaged him beyond repair. The words traveled from porch to shop counter, from church pews to the sheriff's office. He came back from war and brought back madness, they whispered when he walked by. Not loud enough to be confronted, but loud enough to be heard. Elijah felt the weight of it, yet every time he returned home and Shadow trotted up to greet him, the sting of the town's judgment dulled. At night, when the world outside his property line seemed to fold in on itself with suspicion, Elijah would lace up his boots and jog the dirt paths behind the cabin. Shadow ran beside him, ears perked, tail low, a steady companion matching his pace through the darkness. The sound of the dog's breathing, the soft thud of paws on earth, and the occasional bark cutting through the night became a rhythm that pushed back his nightmares. When memories of dusty roads in Afghanistan rose up, along with faces he could not save, he focused on the present, the cool Georgia air, the scent of pine, the shape of shadow running like freedom beside him. Little by little, the tightness in his chest loosened. He began to see how much alike they were, the soldier and the stray. Both had been pushed to the edges of where they belonged. Both had been forced to survive without promises. The scars on Elijah's shoulders and the thin white marks beneath Shadow's fur told versions of the same story, that the world could be indifferent to pain. Yet in each other they found steadiness. When Elijah sat on the porch steps at dusk, watching the sky darken over the fields, Shadow lay at his feet, relaxed but alert, claiming him as his person. Elijah didn't talk much anymore, but when he did, it was often in the presence of the dog, his words low and thoughtful, the way a man speaks when he knows something is finally listening. The town did not understand that kind of loyalty. They saw him walking the back roads with the dog and assumed danger where there was none. Mothers pulled their children closer when he passed. The sheriff slowed his cruiser near the cabin more often, pretending to check flood reports or loose livestock. None of them saw the quiet transformation taking place inside the man they had written off. Shadow was not just company. He was proof that Elijah still had the capacity to care, to protect, to choose gentleness even after years of hardness. In the evenings, when rain tapped against the windows and the rest of Waverly settled into its comfortable prejudices, Elijah sat by the fire with Shadow curled nearby, and for a few hours the world felt right. But the quiet did not last. One autumn night, while the woods lay dark beyond the fence, Shadow lifted his head, ears stiff, and growled toward the tree line at something Elijah could not see. That moment, Elijah finally feared. In Waverly, every secret traveled faster than the wind, and every lie carried the weight of color. By the time autumn settled over the pine line behind Elijah Brooks' cabin, people in town no longer whispered about the black veteran who kept to himself. They whispered about the dog that stayed glued to his side. One small thing went missing, and the rumor machine finally found fuel. It started with Mrs. Cartwell's boy losing a chicken from the coop behind their rented house near the church. The bird could have slipped through loose wire, could have been taken by a fox, could have flown off after a storm. But none of those explanations were interesting. Someone said they had seen a dark dog near the road that morning, and before noon, that simple sighting turned into, "That veteran's animal is roaming free." By evening it became, "He's letting that thing hunt in town." The change was quick, careless, and familiar. Elijah heard about it the next day when he went to buy nails at Jenkins' Hardware. Conversation stopped the moment he stepped in. Mr. Jenkins rang him up without meeting his eyes, and a woman near the paint aisle muttered that some people shouldn't be allowed to keep dogs with their history. Elijah knew what history she meant. Not service, not medals. The other history, the one Waverly had written for him because of his skin. By Friday, the local paper, the Waverly Chronicle, 4 pages and proud, ran a cautious little column wedged between crop prices and church announcements. It didn't name him, but everyone knew. It spoke of concerns raised by residents over an ex-serviceman reportedly keeping an untrained animal on the outskirts of town. It mentioned responsibility, safety, community standards. What it did not mention was the way that man had once worn the country's uniform. What it did not mention was that no dog had attacked anyone. The article gave people permission to fear him with good manners. That night, Elijah sat on his porch with Shadow stretched at his feet, the crickets humming and the pines shifting like they were passing messages. He had felt judgment before, but this was different. This was direction. This was the town deciding that if anything went wrong, a tipped trash can, a frightened child, a missing animal, it would land at his doorstep. The wrong kind of attention always found him. Later, lying awake, the sound of the wind through the pines reminded him of rotor blades over desert sand. Memory pulled him back to that firefight overseas, the one no one in Waverly would ever hear about. His unit had moved through a village under bad intel, and when chaos began, he had done what training demanded: shield, drag, signal, hold, still. 2 men did not come back to base that night. Their names stayed with him, heavy as stones. Command told him it was unavoidable. Elijah had never agreed. Guilt was the thing that followed him home, not the enemy. Now the same unease he had once felt in hostile territory came from front porches and grocery aisles. He could sense eyes on him even when he was just fixing the gutter or walking shadow along the tree line. Cars slowed as they passed his road, their headlights sweeping across his yard in long, accusing arcs. Shadow sensed it too. The dog had begun sleeping across the doorway, chin on paws, eyes alert even in rest. A quiet guardian ready to rise if footsteps crunched on the gravel. One morning he woke to find fresh paint on his fence. The words were not clever, only cruel. Go back where you belong. The paint dripped down the wood in uneven line, the red stark against the weathered boards. Elijah stood there for a long moment, jaw tight, breathing slow. He did not call the sheriff because he knew how that conversation would go. He got a bucket and a brush instead and painted over it, stroke after stroke, until the message disappeared beneath layers of beige. Still, he could feel it glowing there, like the town's true opinion bleeding through. The sheriff finally came by that afternoon, leaning against his cruiser like they were simply neighbors chatting. He told Elijah to keep that beast under control, his tone easy, his eyes not. He spoke of ordinances and complaints, but the meaning beneath was older than any local law. Elijah heard it clearly. Stay small, stay quiet, stay in your place. He nodded to end the visit, though frustration knotted in his chest. Shadow had done nothing but exist beside a man this town refused to claim. The next morning the cabin felt too still. Elijah poured Shadow's food and waited, expecting the familiar patter of paws, but the bowl stayed untouched. The porch was empty, gate slightly ajar, dew disturbed by fresh tracks leading away from the yard. He followed them to the road, heart thudding, eyes scanning the pines. The prince turned toward town, not the woods. Shadow never went toward people on his own. Elijah stared down that path and knew something, or someone, had drawn his dog away, and the trouble waiting there would not be kind. When the fire started, no one in Waverly called for help, not for a black man's land. The night had been unusually still, the kind of heavy silence that makes the pines seem watchful, almost listening. Elijah Brooks had fallen asleep late, a lamp still glowing by the window, his journal open on the table beside him. Shadow lay curled on the rug, breathing slow, the faint movement of his chest, the only sign of life in the cabin. Then came the smell, faint at first, then sharp and undeniable, the scent of smoke drifting in from beyond the porch. Elijah stirred, half caught between dream and memory, until he noticed a dull orange flicker washing across the far wall. He moved to the window and froze. Beyond the fence line, flames licked upward, devouring the dry grass of his small field. Sparks jumped in the wind, dancing across the darkness like cruel fireflies. For a moment, he stood still, confusion wrestling with disbelief. Then instinct took over. He grabbed the bucket by the sink and ran outside, boots sinking into the soft earth as the heat hit him full in the face. The air was alive with the crackle of burning brush and the hiss of sap bursting in the fire. "Shadow!" he shouted, voice cutting through the chaos. The dog had been sleeping just moments ago, but now was nowhere to be seen. The wind carried the flames toward the barn at the edge of the property, an old structure left over from the farm that once stood here, its dry boards ready to burn. Elijah ran toward it, calling the dog's name again. The firelight painted his figure in trembling gold as he reached the gate. Inside, through the smoke, he thought he heard a bark, urgent, strained. He pushed forward, covering his mouth with his sleeve. The barn door was half open, creaking against the pressure of heat. What he saw next froze him. Shadow was there, dragging something, someone, by the shirt collar toward the open air. It was a boy, limp and coughing, his face pale under a layer of soot. Elijah recognized him immediately. The farmer's son, the same child who had once thrown stones at him from across the road, while his father watched without a word. The fire roared around them, but Elijah didn't hesitate. He knelt beside the boy, helping Shadow pull him free from a fallen beam. The child gasped, drawing in air thick with smoke, and Elijah lifted him, shielding his face from the falling ash. Together, man and dog stumbled into the night, the barn collapsing behind them with a sound like thunder. He laid the boy on the grass by the ditch and checked his pulse. Weak, but there. Shadow whined softly, pacing near them, one paw singed and fur blackened in patches. The smell of burnt wood and scorched earth filled the air. Elijah looked back toward town. The fire department should have been there by now. The glow could be seen for miles. Yet no sirens came, no engines, no help. He realized with cold clarity that someone must have called, and someone else must have told them to wait. In Waverly, delay was just another way to punish quietly. By the time the first engine finally arrived, most of Elijah's small field had turned to ash. He stood beside the unconscious boy and Shadow, both marked by smoke, but alive. The firefighters rushed past him without acknowledgement, spraying what remained of the flames. Neighbors began gathering at a distance, their faces half lit by the firelight. The old farmer pushed through the crowd when he spotted his son, shouting the boy's name. Elijah stepped back, letting him kneel beside the child. Relief broke across the man's face, followed by confusion when he saw Shadow limping near Elijah's feet. The sheriff arrived soon after, sirens wailing too late to matter. He clapped the farmer on the shoulder and asked what happened. The man gestured weakly toward the barn, still in shock. When his eyes met Elijah's, something flickered. Shame, perhaps gratitude, but it vanished as quickly as it came. The sheriff turned toward the gathered crowd and said loudly that the boy had been fortunate someone saw the fire early. He didn't say who that someone was. Elijah didn't correct him. There was no point. He just looked down at Shadow, who was now lying in the dirt, breathing shallowly, his coat streaked with soot. He lifted the dog carefully, feeling the tremor of pain ripple through him. The firefighters barely noticed as Elijah carried Shadow away from the scene, back toward the silent cabin, now shadowed by smoke. Behind him, he could hear the murmurs starting again, the same voices that always found new ways to twist truth into suspicion. Inside, he laid Shadow on a blanket by the fire and cleaned his burns with gentle hands, whispering words neither of them needed to understand. The dog's tail gave a faint thump of recognition before stilling again. Outside, the smell of burnt soil hung heavy, a reminder that even mercy could be turned against him here. By morning, word had spread through Waverly. Some said the fire had been an accident. Others claimed the veteran had started it himself for attention. The paper printed another brief article, this one praising the bravery of local responders who had saved the farmer's boy. No mention of a dog, no mention of a man who ran through flame. That afternoon, Elijah found a folded note nailed to his door. The paper was rough, the handwriting jagged and deliberate. It read only, "You'll regret staying here." He held it in his hand for a long moment, the edges curling in the heat of the dying day. Then he tore it in half, letting the pieces fall to the porch boards. The pines rustled in the wind, their whispers returning, but this time they carried something colder than rumor. The hardest part about surviving isn't the pain, it's being blamed for your own wounds. The days after the fire passed in a haze of ash and exhaustion. Smoke still clung to the air around Elijah Brooks' cabin, and though the flames were gone, they'd left behind a quiet that burned in a different way. He spent those first mornings tending to Shadow, whose fur had singed in patches and whose paws were wrapped in gauze that needed changing twice a day. The dog's eyes followed him everywhere, heavy with fatigue but alive, proof that not all rescues end in loss. Elijah treated the wounds with the same care he once used on soldiers overseas. He cleaned, wrapped, and checked them with the precision of a man who understood the value of small details. Shadow would whimper softly as Elijah worked, then settle, trusting the familiar rhythm of his caretaker's hands. The veteran rarely spoke, but when he did, it was to the dog, murmured words of reassurance, spoken as if to steady himself more than the animal. Nights stretched long and sleepless. Each time the wind shifted, bringing the faint scent of burnt pine, Elijah would glance at the horizon, half expecting another glow to rise. But the world remained dark and indifferent. Meanwhile, the town moved on. The burned field became another story to tuck away in Waverly's quiet cruelty. The community gathered to rebuild the old farmer's barn, painting it new as if gratitude could be scrubbed clean of truth. They spoke of blessings and luck, of how the boy had been saved by God's grace. but never mentioned the hands that carried him from the smoke or the dog that bore the marks of the fire. No one thanked Elijah, not publicly, not even privately. Instead, whispers returned, darker than before, that he had started the blaze himself, that he wanted sympathy, that maybe the war had unhinged him for good. He noticed the change in simple gestures. The grocer stopped greeting him when he came in for supplies. The hardware store clerk found reasons to delay serving him, turning to other customers with a forced smile. At the diner, where he once sat in the corner with black coffee, the waitress now pretended not to see him. The distance between him and the rest of Waverly grew like a widening crack in a frozen river. Every cold glance reminded him that his good deeds would always come second to the color of his skin. In that silence, Elijah turned inward. He pulled an old notebook from a drawer and began to write, at first in fragments, then in full sentences that stretched into pages. He wrote about the war, about the friends he had lost, about the noise that never really stopped ringing in his ears. He wrote about Waverly, too, not out of anger, but out of necessity. It was as if the paper was the only place that didn't flinch when he spoke truth. Each night, he filled the pages until sleep finally took him beside Shadow, whose breathing anchored the quiet. Weeks later, a new voice arrived in town, one that didn't carry the same rehearsed politeness as the locals. Clara Hensley, a young reporter from Atlanta, stepped off the bus with a leather satchel and a notebook of her own. She had come chasing a story about small-town racism in the South, a series for the regional paper she worked for. Waverly, with its spotless lawns and whispered divisions, looked perfect from the outside. That illusion made it ideal. At first, the townsfolk welcomed her smiles and her curiosity. They offered coffee and surface answers, careful not to say the wrong things. But when she mentioned hearing about the veteran on the edge of town, conversations grew short. A few people dismissed him as troubled, others deflected with polite shrugs. The more they avoided the subject, the clearer it became to Clara that something beneath the surface was festering. One shopkeeper finally muttered that she ought to stay clear of that man, claiming he keeps a dangerous dog. Curiosity turned to conviction. Clara rented a room at the old inn and spent her days walking through the streets, asking quiet questions. When she finally found Elijah's cabin, she didn't knock right away. She watched from the edge of the field, seeing the man and the dog, both marked by survival, moving in slow unison. Elijah was repairing a broken section of fence, his sleeves rolled up, each motion deliberate, calm. Shadow limped slightly, but stayed close, eyes on his master. To her, the sight wasn't dangerous. It was human. She introduced herself gently when she finally approached. Elijah was cautious but polite, offering little beyond brief nods and one-word answers. Clara didn't push. She returned the next day, and the one after that, sometimes leaving small offerings, a stack of blank notebooks, a newspaper, or just conversation. Through her eyes, the story began to shift. She saw a man trapped between two wars. One fought overseas, the other waged silently in his hometown. She saw how the same steadiness that made him a soldier now made him a survivor of prejudice. Days passed, and her notes filled with more than facts. She wrote about the tension between truth and silence, about the way fear disguised itself as civility in Waverly. She drafted a piece titled, "The Man They Tried to Forget," shaping it with careful compassion, knowing it might cost her the trust of those who had welcomed her in. When she told Elijah she wanted to tell his story, he said nothing. But for the first time in months, he didn't ask her to leave. As she packed her notes one evening, ready to submit her article to the paper the next morning, the air outside shifted. The night grew heavy, the kind of stillness that comes before something breaks. Clouds rolled low and gray over Waverly, their weight pressing down on rooftops. The smell of rain carried through the open window, and thunder muttered far away. By midnight, the first drops began to fall, slow, deliberate, and endless. The storm of the century was arriving, and with it, every truth the town had tried to bury was about to be unearthed. When the levee broke, prejudice drowned first. Then came the screams. The rain had started before dawn, slow and steady, the kind that whispered of trouble, but gave people time to pretend it wouldn't come. By midday, it no longer whispered. Sheets of water slammed against rooftops, turning streets into rivers and gutters into roaring streams. The sky had darkened to a strange greenish gray, heavy and alive, and the wind screamed through the pine trees like a warning too late to heed. Elijah Brooks stood at his cabin window, watching the storm tear across the fields. Water rushed past his porch in wide, muddy streaks, carrying sticks, leaves, and fragments of the land he'd worked to keep steady. Shadow stood beside him, ears flat, tail tense, the instinct to protect pressing through every muscle. Clara Hensley's car sat half buried in the ditch by the road, the tires already sinking in mud. She'd come that morning to drop off a printed copy of her article for him to read before sending it, but the weather had trapped her instead. Now she sat near the fire, her notebook clutched tight, eyes flicking between the howling windows and the trembling light of the lamp. The radio crackled every few minutes with fragments of news. The levee north of Waverly had failed. The river had burst through its banks, swallowing bridges, flooding back roads, and washing away fences and power poles alike. The electricity blinked once, then died for good. In that sudden darkness, the town that had turned its back on him was now crying for help in every direction. Elijah felt it before he heard it, that old shift inside him, the one that had kept him alive overseas. He grabbed his flashlight, checked the straps of his raincoat, and looked to Shadow. "Come on," he said quietly, the words automatic, steady. The dog barked once, sharp and ready. Clara started to protest, but the resolve in his face silenced her. He wasn't running toward danger this time out of duty. He was walking into it because someone had to. Outside, the rain bit like cold glass. The road was nearly invisible under the moving water. Somewhere in the distance, he could hear people shouting, their voices swallowed by wind and thunder. Elijah moved carefully, his boots sinking deep with every step. Shadow leading ahead, nose low to the ground. They followed the sound, the desperate rhythm of human fear. By the river bank, the scene was chaos. Families clung to porch rails, trying to reach higher ground as the water rose. A car floated near the bridge, its lights flickering under the current before they blinked out completely. Elijah waded in without hesitation, the cold stealing his breath, but not his focus. Shadow swam ahead, pushing through the current with strong, deliberate strokes. The dog barked toward a faint cry that came from a patch of collapsed fencing. Elijah followed, fighting the pull of the river, until he reached a woman and her daughter clinging to a half-submerged gate. He helped them onto a nearby embankment, his movements measured and calm, the kind of calm born from surviving chaos before. Word spread quickly through those who could still talk. The veteran and his dog were out in the storm, helping whoever they could. In a place that had refused him kindness, his name now passed from mouth to mouth not as a rumor, but as hope. He and Shadow moved through the night like two shadows themselves, appearing where the water was deepest, where cries were faintest, where fear was thickest. Every time Shadow barked, it led them to another stranded soul, a man trapped in a car, an elderly couple on a porch, a child crying in a tree. They worked in silence, side by side, until hours lost their shape and only survival mattered. Near midnight, the storm reached its peak. The sheriff's voice came over the radio once, then cut to static. Elijah found his patrol car half submerged near the bridge, the current pressing it sideways against the guardrail. The sheriff was inside, trapped, pounding weakly against the glass. For a heartbeat, Elijah hesitated, the memory of past warnings, of the man's veiled threats and cold stares. Then he moved. He climbed onto the hood, pried the door open with a crowbar, and pulled the sheriff out into the freezing water. The man gasped, eyes wide with shock, as Elijah dragged him toward the shore. No words passed between them, just the unspoken knowledge that for once they stood on the same side of fear. By the time Elijah reached the main road again, his body ached from cold and exhaustion. Clara found him there an hour later, flashlight trembling in her hand. She had been searching too, wading through knee-deep water to find the people she'd been writing about. She saw him helping an elderly woman into the back of a rescue truck, Shadow beside him, fur soaked and darkened by mud. In that moment, the story she had come to tell rewrote itself completely. This wasn't about racism in a small town anymore. It was about what happens when humanity finally breaks through its own walls. The storm began to ease just before dawn. The rain softened to a steady drizzle, and the wind faded into silence. The outlines of Waverly reappeared under a gray, trembling sky. a town humbled, stripped bare of its arrogance. Elijah stood in the middle of the road, the water lapping at his boots, his heart pounding from the effort. Clara approached, her coat clinging to her like a second skin, her voice quiet. "You saved them," she said. But Elijah only shook his head. His eyes were searching, scanning the riverbank. Shadow was gone. He called out once, twice, his voice cracking against the morning. The water continued to flow, carrying branches, debris, and silence. Clara looked upriver, but there was no movement, no sound of barking, no ripple breaking the surface. Elijah stepped forward, calling again, louder this time. Only the wind answered. As dawn broke over the flooded town, Waverly's streets shimmered under the first light. Families gathered in doorways, their faces pale with exhaustion and disbelief. Somewhere beneath that pale gold sky, the river still carried its secrets. Elijah stood motionless, staring into the current, unwilling to accept what it suggested. The water had not yet receded, and Shadow, his loyal companion, his mirror of resilience, was nowhere to be found. In the silence after the storm, one bark echoed louder than 100 apologies. Morning had come to Waverly not with celebration, but with a stunned kind of stillness. Water still sat in the streets, brown and slow, branches and roof shingles floating past like pieces of a memory torn apart. People stood outside their homes in boots and blankets, counting family members, scanning for damage, trying to understand how a single night could rewrite everything they thought was secure. Amid all of it, Elijah Brooks was searching for one thing, not a possession, not a roof, not even his own recognition. He was searching for Shadow. He had walked the flooded road 3 times before others began to notice his urgency. Clara followed him, shoes soaked, notebook forgotten for once. She called the sheriff, the fire crew, anyone with a boat or truck that still ran, telling them plainly that the dog was more than a dog, that he had led rescues through the night and was likely still doing it. At first, some dismissed it. In a town that had spent years calling a black veteran unstable, it was not easy for them to admit his animal might be the bravest among them. But the storm had already humbled their pride, and soon small groups began combing through the neighborhoods, calling Shadow's name through ruined streets. They found him because of the sound, not a panicked bark, not a hurt cry, but a deliberate, commanding bark that rose and fell like it had purpose. It carried from the direction of the old schoolhouse near the river, a building that hadn't been used in years, but had been reopened the night before as an emergency shelter. The back wall had collapsed when the water swept through, and now the structure leaned, half buried in mud and broken boards. Shadow stood on top of the debris, soaked and shaking, barking in sharp bursts toward the hole in the wall. Elijah ran first. He saw the dog's paw scraped raw, fur caked with mud, and for a moment relief nearly brought him to his knees. But then he heard it, the faint cry underneath the rubble. Children, trapped. Shadow looked at Elijah, then back at the gap like he was telling him to hurry. Elijah didn't waste a second. He shouted to the others, and within minutes a line of volunteers, townspeople, firemen, even the same sheriff he'd pulled from his patrol car, gathered to dig. The work was slow, heavy and wet. Boards had to be pried up carefully so the structure wouldn't fall the rest of the way. Mud sucked at their boots as they lifted soaked lumber and broken window frames. All the while, Shadow refused to move from his post. He barked whenever they stopped, as if urging them on, then lay his ear against the opening to listen for sound. Elijah kept glancing at him, drawing strength from the animal's refusal to quit. This, he realized, was what all their nights of healing had built toward. A dog once abandoned, now refusing to abandon others. When they finally pulled away, enough debris, Elijah slid inside the narrow pocket of space. 2 small children were huddled there, drenched, shivering, eyes wide with fear. They stared at him like he was someone out of a story. He told them to stay still and reach back to guide them out, handing each one to the volunteers outside. Shadow whined softly, tail wagging weakly as each child emerged. And then came the realization the schoolhouse wasn't the only place Shadow had stopped. As more volunteers compared notes, they discovered that families on Maple Road, the elderly couple on Harris Lane, and even the pastor's wife had all said the same thing. The dog had come to their porches in the night, barking relentlessly, until someone followed him to a stranded neighbor. By the time the last child was lifted out and wrapped in blankets, news cameras from the regional station had arrived, tipped off by Clara. She stood beside the rescue line, hair plastered to her forehead, voice steady as she spoke into the microphone. She didn't sensationalize it. She told it plain. A black veteran and the stray dog he once saved had guided the town through the worst storm in years. The camera panned to Elijah, whose clothes were soaked and whose hands were raw from digging, and to Shadow, whose chest rose and fell in heavy breaths. It was a picture the town could not deny, courage wearing the face it had once rejected. Public shame and admiration collided in that muddy schoolyard. Some residents lowered their eyes when they saw Elijah, too aware of the graffiti, the ignored calls for help, the lies in the paper. Others walked up slowly, unsure how to thank a man they had refused to see. The sheriff stood off to the side, staring at the dog like he was seeing him for the first time. Children clung to their parents, pointing at Shadow like he was a hero from television. For once, the town had to admit that goodness had come from the person they had labeled dangerous. Elijah did not give speeches. He didn't tell them they were wrong or remind them of the night of the burning field. He simply knelt beside Shadow, running a hand over his head, letting the attention fall where it belonged. Shadow's loyalty spoke louder than any words. A dog who had been starved, judged, nearly taken, had still chosen to save the very people who might have turned him away. That kind of truth didn't need explanation. Clara captured it all: the muddy boots, the rescued children, the weary veteran, and the dog whose bark had led them there. Her article would now be more than a piece. It would be evidence. This was not just a story of racism, but of how that racism shattered when survival demanded honesty. Waverly could no longer pretend Elijah Brooks was a problem. He had become the proof that they were. As cleanup crews began to arrive and the schoolhouse was marked off, the mayor, flustered and red-faced, made his way through the crowd. He spoke to the cameras, announcing that the town would hold a public ceremony to honor the heroes who stood strong for Waverly. His eyes flicked toward Elijah, toward Shadow, toward the truth he could no longer erase. The crowd murmured in agreement, some out of gratitude, some out of guilt. But as the mayor extended the invitation, Elijah's expression changed. He looked out over the town, the same porches that had ignored him, the same faces that had whispered, and something inside him hesitated. Sometimes a town must lose everything before it learns what humanity really means. In the weeks after the storm, Waverly no longer looked like the proud, closed-off place it had been. It looked like a town that had been stripped down to its bones. Fences were gone, paint was peeled, lawns were soaked with river mud, and even the church steeple wore a stain where the water had reached. Yet beneath the wreckage, something gentler moved. Neighbors who once nodded from a distance now worked shoulder to shoulder, passing sandbags, hammering loose boards, cooking for families whose kitchens were ruined. Disasters have a way of making people honest, and the storm had forced Waverly to admit who had really saved it. It wasn't the mayor, and it wasn't the old money families whose names hung on plaques downtown. It was the man who lived on the edge of town and the dog he once found starving behind a diner. Clara Hensley knew that was the real center of the story. And when power was restored and the roads opened, she drove back to Atlanta and filed the article exactly as she'd promised. She titled it, "The Man They Tried to Forget," and she didn't soften the parts about racism, neglect, or delayed help. She wrote about the graffiti on the fence, the lies in the paper, and the night the town pretended not to see a black veteran's field burning. The story spread faster than even she expected. Regional outlets picked it up first, then national platforms that were hungry for something that showed both the reality of prejudice and the possibility of grace. Donations began arriving at the Waverly Council office, and more surprisingly, at Elijah's post office box. Some came from veterans who recognized the look in his eyes from the photos Clara had sent. Some came from black families in distant cities who knew exactly what it meant to be heroic and unseen. A few came from white readers who simply wrote, "We were wrong." Money, supplies, even building materials flowed in, not because the town was special, but because the humility of one man and his dog had made it worthy of help. The town council, perhaps sensing a chance to rewrite its own name, approved the idea for a memorial, Not a statue of a general or a donor, but something different, a simple stone plaza near the riverbank, at the place where rescues had been launched during the flood. At its center would stand two bronzed figures, a soldier standing still, not in combat stance but in quiet vigilance, and a dog beside him, head tilted as if listening. For once Waverly wanted to honor love, not power, and strangely, no one objected. On the day of the unveiling, the sky was clear in the way it only becomes after weeks of rain, washed, open, forgiving. People arrived in clothes still worn from cleanup, boots splattered with dried mud, hair sunburned from working outside. Children who had been rescued from the schoolhouse sat in the front row with their parents. The sheriff stood off to the side in full uniform, hat in hand, his eyes searching for Elijah. Clara was there too, camera crew beside her. Not as an outsider this time, but as someone Waverly owed its honesty to. Elijah arrived without ceremony. He wore a clean shirt, boots polished as best as floodwater allowed, and walked with the steady, unhurried pace of a man who had stopped needing approval. Shadow walked beside him, older now from the ordeal, one leg still stiff, fur patched where burns had healed, yet his eyes were bright, alert, sweeping the crowd as if checking that every person was safe. Conversations hushed as the pair crossed the grass. For once, nobody turned away. The mayor spoke first, saying all the right things about courage and unity, and how disaster had brought out the best of Waverly. People clapped politely, but the moment that mattered wasn't his speech. It came when the sheriff, the same man who once warned Elijah to keep that beast under control, stepped forward and extended his hand. He didn't speak. He didn't make a public apology. He simply held out his hand in front of everyone. Elijah looked at it for a long second, then took it. That single gesture carried every unspoken confession the town owed him. When the cloth was pulled from the memorial, sunlight struck the bronze in a way that made it look almost alive. The crowd fell quiet. There, immortalized in metal, stood the image of what Waverly had become at its best. A veteran not asking for praise and a dog ready to move at any sound of distress. Children pointed, whispering to each other that they knew that dog. Older residents wiped their eyes discreetly. Clara snapped photo after photo, knowing she was capturing not just redemption, but evidence of change. Elijah stayed beside Shadow as the crowd dispersed, letting the noise fade into afternoon warmth. For the first time since coming home, he did not feel like a visitor in his own town. He felt placed, rooted, seen. Shadow shifted, leaning against his leg, breathing slow from age and effort. The dog lifted his head, eyes meeting Elijah's with a knowing calm, as if to hand the weight of everything back to him. Mission complete, the look seemed to say, before the sunlight left them. If this story moved you, if it made you believe that kindness can still change the world, then share it, so more people remember what loyalty truly means. Don't forget to subscribe. Every story here carries a heartbeat worth hearing. Before you go, tell me one thing. If the world turned its back on you, would you still have the strength to save it?